As a former journalist, I am not a techie by nature. So I always had to, when I was coming up, figure out how to take the tech speak and put it in the simplest terms possible. So whenever I'm talking to an executive, I let them know that security is just a practice in risk management, right? You have some bad things that could happen. You have some ways to reduce the risk or the likelihood or the impact that those bad things will happen. And what's left over is your residual risk. Identity is one of those things that you can do to either reduce the impact or reduce the likelihood that something bad could happen. So when I was listening, to your podcast before, and we were talking about attack vectors, I think Kazi was talking about attack vectors, right? And some of the top attack vectors that we see these days, if you look at RSM's attack vector report, is around phishing. So business email compromise, those are oftentimes stem from phishing. You get password guessing, or weak passwords is another way. Those are all related to identity and identity management. So that becomes, having good, strong identity practices, having good, strong authentication practices, all of those different pieces are what reduces that likelihood or that impact of that bad actor getting into your environment.
This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
Doing great. Hey, I actually almost said something different. That would have been the first time in ever.
Yeah, we're usually on autopilot for that opener, but what do you got?
Yeah. No, so, the big news of the day today, we're recording on Thursday. What's today's date? The
February 13th. Mm-hmm.
And Zilla Security announced that they've been acquired by CyberArk. The words that they used was, we're now part of CyberArk, but I think it couldn't have happened to a nicer bunch of people. So congratulations to everybody from Zilla. We've had Nitin, their CPO, on. That was episode 303. We've had Deepak on, their CEO, and that was episode 269. So go back, check out those episodes if you want to know more about their platform. But that was the big news in our space today.
Yeah, I don't want to draw any correlations, but being on the Identity Center podcast tends to lead to good things for companies. Like we've had that. We've seen a lot of seed rounds get announced recently with some of the sponsors we've had on here. So I'm not going to draw any correlations, but if you're looking to get exposure, it's probably a good place to do it. So.
It's hard to say that being on the podcast hurts.
Yeah, that's true. It only hurts people's ears or maybe faces as they're trying to watch this on YouTube, but we do try to make it as entertaining and informing as possible. And it's conversational, right? We try not to make it too much of a commercial, but congrats to them. Look, they found success. They've got a nice product, and hopefully we see more of them in the future as part of whatever that holds for them, right? As part of the CyberArk.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just as much congratulations for CyberArk because the whole Zilla security product with the Zeus functionality. I thought that was really revolutionary. Like when we do those sponsor spotlight episodes, I get really excited about things, but I don't. It's not fake. I don't have to fake that excitement and enthusiasm. Like they've got a good product.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not going to fake any excitement or enthusiasm today. I am actually, and I'm looking forward to today's conversation because I've worked with this person now for a couple of years, and he's legit. We started this podcast series back in January, and we're kind of partnering up a little bit with our employers, RSM, to do this series of how cybersecurity intersects with parts of digital identity. And the whole point is to become more well-rounded from a digital identity perspective, because I think a lot of people fall into this hole and this trap of, well, I'm an identity person and I don't know anything else, or I don't care about anything else. There are so many other components that interact and impact the way that digital identity works, with, especially within a business, that I thought it would be a good idea, and you thought it would be a good idea. We thought it would be a good idea to kind of figure out, okay, how can we become more well-rounded and kind of put together this program? So we've got, I think, 10 or 11 episodes that we're going to put out through the rest of the year around this. And we started with Ghazi a couple weeks ago, kind of kick things off while we were recording at Gartner. If you missed that episode, definitely go back, not just for the good conversation with Ghazi, but also, Jim, you had a hat on, and, it drew some comments.
Hey, man, when the Texans do as the Texans do.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I didn't see many Texans doing what you were doing, but I liked it. I thought it was cool.
No, I mean, outside of the identity conference for identity people, there were plenty of people wearing that style of hat. For anybody who hasn't figured it out, it was a cowboy hat.
A cowboy hat, and then what do you call that jacket? I call it the Hugh Hefner jacket because it's like that crushed kind of burgundy or like wine velvet.
It is a smoking jacket.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you were smoking. That's for sure.
Listen, I realize I'm not supposed to be talking yet, but I think Ghazi wore that same outfit in the Northwest this week when we were at a client, and I made comments about it.
So we need pictures of that.
I wish I had them, but it was like, yes, the same jacket, the same hat. Did you give it to him?
No, but maybe I'm starting a trend.
That's a trend that I will get on. I won't do it, but I will gladly watch other people do it. That's for sure. So why don't we jump into it? Because that voice you just heard was Mr. Matt Franko. He's a principal at RSM, and he's responsible for cyber strategy here along with us. So Matt, welcome to the show officially.
I am very excited to be here. When I was asked to come on the show, I couldn't believe it, first off, because I thought it was just identity folks. So here I am, very excited to go ahead and get started.
Yeah, so why don't we start with a little bit about your background? I think one of the things that we try to do is when we first start off and we kind of introduce people and to our audiences, a little bit about how they got started in the space, because I feel like there's a lot of different ways, a lot of good stories. Yours is a good one too. So let's start. Normally I would ask, how did you get into identity? But I feel like we need to go broader here. How did you get into the cybersecurity space? And then we'll just kind of go from there.
Yeah. So mine's an interesting one, at least I think. But I think everybody says that they fell into it by accident. Actually, when I was listening to your podcast with Ghazi, I wanted to make sure I did not say all of the exact same things he says, because we work together a lot. But mine is unique in that it's probably not unique for everybody at the time. And in our generation, I feel like a lot of folks got into cyber that didn't go to school for cyber. So surprise, I did not go to school for cyber. But what I did go to school for is journalism. And I had this dream that I wanted to be a sports broadcaster. I went through all of college thinking I was going to do that. I worked at a news station in Cleveland for a while. And then when I was graduating college, I knew I did not want to do that anymore. I took a job in the industry. I spent 3 days at that job, quit, moved home, started to apply for colleges. I was going to go back to school to become a teacher. And a company called Secure State was advertising for a 3-month contract through the Early Childhood PTA magazine that my sister-in-law was a member of.
Okay, that's unique. I got to jump in there because, that one I haven't.
That one, yeah. Your boss, Daniel, always likes to joke that I was found in the PTA. Sort of, yeah. So I took that job. During the interview process, they liked what they saw on the journalism side, and they wanted me to come join for PR. So I did the contract, move over to PR, got into marketing. From marketing, got into sales. From sales, got into, they launched, the CEO at the time, or for all of the time, Ken Stasiak, launched another company that focused on federal government contracting. And that's where I cut my teeth on the consulting side and just kind of continued from there. And then we got acquired by RSM back in 2018. And here I am.
So what kind of company was Secure State? Like, what was the the product or the service, or what did it do?
Yep. So Secure State was a management consulting firm that focused on information security. So we did a lot of program development, virtual CISO, penetration testing was probably our biggest thing back in the day, right on through to helping organizations out with remediation support. So boutique in size, I think when we got acquired, we were about 50 or so people. And we joined RSM, it was about 100 people. So it was, unique to join an organization with the platform like RSM has, where we were able to expand, quite a bit, quite quickly. And, it's been a great ride.
What was been, I guess, the best thing coming out of that? Because I want to focus on a positive. Typically when there's an acquisition, some things change, but what did it allow you to do that you couldn't do before?
Yeah. So I was part of the team that got to vet the organizations that were going to buy Secure State.
So they had to interview you and you interviewing them. Right?
Yeah, it was interesting. The thing that was the most exciting and the reason why I was in the majority that voted for RSM was the platform. So at Secure State, we didn't do implementations. So identity was out of the question. We didn't do remediation support too much. Like there were certain things that we could, spot fix and stuff like that. And it was that ability to expand your relationship to be able to help your clients more holistically versus coming in and being like, yeah, you need to fix this stuff. And when they turn to you and say, can you fix it? And you're like, yeah, we could, but it's not really what we're here to do. And then the scale and size of the opportunities that we got into were much bigger. When you're a boutique, it's a lot harder for buyers in the organization to say, I'm going to put my whole, security plan and program in your hands as a boutique versus when you come to an organization the size of RSM, those doors just open up a lot more from that perspective. I
can definitely appreciate that because Jim and I both came from boutique consulting, and absolutely everything you're saying is like, yep, totally get it. Totally makes sense. One of the things that when I introduced you, I said, responsible for cyber strategy. What the heck is cyber strategy? What does that mean?
Yeah. So in RSM, it's a collection of services and offerings that we have, and individuals that focus on those delivery of those services and offerings. I like to think of it more like a mindset, and where it is that management consulting type approach to cybersecurity. So what we're doing in this group, and we all connect together, really we go more, this is just how we structure, but a cyber strategy team, or what we're doing from that perspective, is helping our clients understand where their program is today and where it needs to go in the future, and then helping to really build that transformation roadmap, if you will, to get there, and pulling in and helping to understand all of the different components that you would need to make that program go, whether it is program documentation, whether it's figuring out what resources or people you might need and what that blend and what that skill set looks like, how much budget you're going to need to spend, and then what are the tools that you need to enable those programs to be able to effectively manage your risk as an organization and utilize your company's funds or dollars or resources appropriately.
So, Matt, we're going to talk about risk management and the intersection of digital identity today. Where should we start this conversation? What is risk in the context of digital identity?
Well, risk is the foundational aspect of security, right? We say this to people all the time. As a former journalist, I am not a techie by nature. So I always had to, when I was coming up, figure out how to take the tech speak and put it in the simplest terms possible. So whenever I'm talking to an executive, I let them know that security is just a practice in risk management, right? You have some bad things that could happen. You have some ways to reduce the risk or the likelihood or the impact that those bad things will happen. And what's left over is your residual risk. Identity is one of those things that you can do to either reduce the impact or reduce the likelihood that something bad could happen. So when I was listening, to your podcast before, and we were talking about attack vectors, I think Kazu was talking about attack vectors, right? And some of the top attack vectors that we see these days, if you look at RSM's attack vector report, is around phishing. So business email compromise, those are oftentimes stem from phishing. You get password guessing, or weak passwords is another way. Those are all related to identity and identity management. So that becomes, having good, strong identity practices, having good, strong authentication practices, all of those different pieces are what reduces that likelihood or that impact of that bad actor getting into your environment.
Yeah, I remember when we first talked, you made the statement that risk should drive strategy. And I wanted to unpack that a little bit. What did you mean by that? It seemed like kind of like the foundation of your thinking when it comes to risk and strategy.
Correct. So again, cybersecurity is a practice in risk management, right? So the first step that you would typically, take in developing a cybersecurity program is to understand your risk landscape. What are the threats that are out there that are targeting you as an organization? What are the vectors through which those threats might get through? And then from there, figure out what are the controls that I need to apply to my environment to reduce that risk. Or, as I like to look at it, how do I change my business processes too, so that way I inherently take on less risk in the way that we operate? So that foundational aspect, that first step, is getting an understanding of the risks and then building your plan, from there. I like to liken it to anything else that you do in life, right? If you're gonna go travel around the world, you're gonna take a look at what good things could happen, what bad things could happen, and then you're going to build your plans accordingly.
Yeah. So that foundational element are what are the risks? So let me ask the how question. Like, how do I come up with the list of the risks, and what is there like a prioritization effort that I need to go through? How does that work? If practitioners sitting here listening to you today, what's your advice?
Yeah, there's a lot of different exercises that you can do to develop your risk landscape. The NIST 800-30 publication, and I know you like NIST. We were talking about it before, but that publication has a list of risks that you can use. I personally like to not necessarily look at risk scenarios, but more attack vectors, because I can't necessarily control who's going to target me or how they're going to target me from a scenario standpoint. But what I can't control are those attack vectors and those variables. So I like to look at, what attack vectors are open in my organization, be it internet access through the internet. If I'm an organization that is e-commerce and I'm transacting a lot through the internet, social engineering aspects or business email compromises. I use wireless, access, and I have wireless access points everywhere. I have a lot of physical, access if I'm a health system and everything's open, or I'm in higher ed and everything's open, right? I like to look at all of the different vectors that a bad actor would look at and then start to build my risks out from there. NIST 830, like I said, does it. And then there are other solutions out there. The MITRE ATT&CK framework does a good job at helping you get an understanding as well for how an attacker might come after you. The industry, there's a lot of industry sharing. The ISACs that are out there, FS ISAC or healthcare ISAC, et cetera, where you can get a lot of that information to get an understanding of what is my inherent risk profile like. And then from there, you can start to build out your plan.
Yeah, I think it sounds like risks are very individual to the organization, which I guess is kind of a common sense thing, right? I mean, some companies they're at risk that somebody would try to pull off a financial crime. Others might be the target of state actors. But I would think in this day and age, like, even if you're not a primary target for a state actor, you never know, right? Can you completely rule that out?
I don't think so. Maybe state actors. State actors are typically going to go after critical infrastructure, which everybody's basically critical infrastructure these days, right? So I guess you're talking me right into it. I'm one that doesn't think that matters. There's philosophical arguments you can get into. I actually get into one all the time with one of my colleagues here. I could see where their techniques and their tools and the resources they have to target you are different, and they might be a little bit more advanced. But if you have your front door open and somebody's walking by, they're going to be able to get in. So you do at some point have to do the minimum standards, if you will, regardless of who you are. And that's where we try and help organizations understand and executives understand that they need to really, focus on building out a program and managing risk effectively.
Wasn't this where I think where likelihood comes part of the equation, right? It's not just the risk itself, because we can say, well, everything's a risk, but what is the likelihood that, a state actor is doing something versus, just random target of opportunity? You left the front door open. I looked in. Oh yeah, look at that. An S3 bucket. Sure, I'll help myself to the contents, right, of this buffet of information. I would imagine likelihood is a big part of how you define the risk as part of that calculation, because I can easily see people getting paralyzed by the sheer number of things that could go wrong. How do we stop that paralyzation from happening by saying, okay, that's great, and I'm glad you're thinking with the security hat on, but the likelihood of that is probably not as high as these other things. Let's focus elsewhere.
Yeah, that's where those variables come. NIST 830 can be very overwhelming. I can't tell you the number of scenarios. Somebody told me the exact number the other day, but that's a big list of scenarios. And then in my brain, I'm like, okay, let's say we do all of those scenarios. There's a scenario that's not in there that's going to happen. So that's why I like to look at the variables. When you think of, a risk equation in and of itself, you look at threats times vulnerabilities and then subtract your countermeasures. And that typically gets you the measurement of risk. So when we look at impact, I like to look at data sets. I like to look at, your systems and what those systems do for you as an organization. And if those systems or that data was compromised, what would the impact be? Your likelihood. A lot of times you could tie to the attack vectors that you have open, the industry that you're in. When you think of physical security, whether or not you're in an area of high crime or you're in an area of low crime, that ties into your likelihood. So your threats are impact likelihood. Then from a countermeasure standpoint, that is where you're getting into, or your vulnerabilities are the things that you have open. A lot of times folks will say that's the absence of controls, but the things that you have open are the things that then bad guys can take advantage of from a vulnerability standpoint. Then you look at your countermeasures, and that's your frameworks that are out there. That's your NIST 800-53 or 171 or your PCI DSS, NIST CSF, so on and so forth, right? And that's why when you think of developing a program, you do hear a lot of individuals talking about the frameworks that are out there that they can use And that's a framework of controls to help guide what you're trying to do. So in a basic sense, a lot of the things that you're taught, the frameworks that you could use, ISO has an approach, the International Standards Organization, NIST has an approach, the National Institute of Standards, that for them falls under 800-37, which is the risk management framework, which takes you through the whole process of figuring out, again, what are your risks, how do you categorize your assets, and then applying your controls based on that risk level, based on that categorization.
It's funny you said, Jim, you love NIST, and I think that NIST is a little humbling because there's so much there that ultimately, the more I talk to someone like you, the more I realize, like, yeah, I don't know how all that works. But let's talk about risk in terms that the identity practitioner is going to understand. So, are we talking about things like data breaches and ransomware? Is that the risk, or is that a description of the risk? Where does that fall?
Yeah, it's definitely a risk, right? So a data breach is when a risk is realized. And people have access to your data, and they're exfiltrating that data out of your environment. Ransomware, same idea, right? A lot of times those two things go hand in hand. But that's what we're looking to reduce the likelihood of, or the impact, if it were to happen in an organization. And we use identity in a lot of ways to protect against that from happening. So we do that through multi-factor authentication, strong passwords, limiting identity and limiting access or rights for folks to the least amount that they need to do their job. And then, you can limit the impact by limiting what an individual might have the rights to access once they're inside an environment. So think of phishing as one of those attack vectors. If I, as an individual within an organization, have rights to everything, I'm the domain admin, and I get phished and I provide my credentials, or a bad guy gets access to my machine, they're able then to do whatever they want in the environment because they have domain admin. In one of our strategies or one of our recommendations or one of the controls that you have inside of an organization is that I shouldn't be using my domain admin credentials for my everyday. And the reason why you prescribe that control is because it reduces the risk if I were to be compromised. Because if I get compromised using my normal credentials, they might get access to my laptop. They might get access to a shared drive that I have files on, but they won't get access to everything. Now, they could scrape things off of my system if I'm an admin on there. They can, pull down hash credentials, escalate and elevate privileges and all that fun stuff. But in its simplest sense, if I only have minimal access to do my job, you're going to reduce the impact of me getting phished through those controls, and those controls that a lot of times we prescribe are around identity.
You mentioned identity being such an important part of the strategy to reduce and mitigate some of these risks. Obviously, we believe it. We've called this podcast Identity at the Center for a reason. How accurate is that to say, is identity, I'm going to make a statement here. Is identity the number one vector for attacks that people should be thinking about? And when I say that, I mean passwords, I mean the lack of MFA, I mean the lack of controls around access in general, or is there other, of course there are other components, but which one do you see as bigger than identity, if that's not true?
It's probably top 5. Another vector would be...
Just say it, Matt. We're the most important. IAM is most important. You're on the Identity at the Center podcast, man.
I mean, listen, if, again, you go back to those attack vectors that I mentioned earlier, it is probably 1 and 2 or have to do with, I always call it user awareness, right? Users clicking bad links, users creating bad passwords. So, it's 1 or 2. Some of the other ones that we've seen out there are individuals not knowing what they have exposed to the internet. So unpatched devices that are exposed to the internet that should not have been. So that to me comes back to, asset management and understanding what assets you have. So, inventory is probably the first step that we take. Understand what you have in your environment before then you step to making sure you lock down access. But it certainly is at the center. I was gonna finish your words for you.
That's right. I get a nickel every time.
You did it for me. I was like, I guess what you could say is identity is at the center. Whether that is for on-prem devices, whether that is for software as a service, moving things to Azure, you have to make sure that you are locking down access to the least amount possible, and people are not abusing the rights that they have. And again, that all comes back to the tools and processes that you put in place to manage that aspect of your program. And that's, where you guys come in is, helping to understand and figure out with us, what are the right tools? What are the right processes based on the organizational profile, the threat profile, and, the overarching risks that they have within their company. So.
And that's the trick, right? I think there's so many tools and budgets are always limited. How do you find the right tool? And do you even need a tool? Sometimes the answer is not a tool. It could be, a people or a process type thing, right? Change the way you do the business, resolve a risk, things like that. There's so much that goes into this. And I think we've heard over the last several years, a lot of buzzwords, zero trust, cloud first, zero standing privileges, now AI is out there. What stock do you put into some of those? They're not really frameworks, but ideas on how to approach security from, different aspects.
Yeah. I mean, to me, zero trust is the most obvious. I know we like to use buzzwords and we like to make the old new again by using said buzzwords. But zero trust is the way that anybody's built security, from the beginning. And the key is to not trust anything until you know that it is safe. So this goes all the way back. I was telling Jim I was going to go all the way back to ancient times, right? You built walls around your castles, you built moats, you built all that stuff. And you didn't let anybody in from the outside unless you could verify who they were and whether or not they were on your side. So to me, it's making the old new again. I think that is definitely a strong approach to things, is to make sure you're denying access to everything and only allowing by exception. I think that's number one rule. But identity solutions play an extremely important role there. The authentication mechanisms that you use play an extremely important role there. I can't remember what were some of those other buzzwords that you use.
So I talk about things like cloud, and obviously there's AI is kind of branded everything now. Every tool seems
everything's
like
got AI in it. Yeah,
yeah. Like, what stock do you put in some of this? I guess, where do we separate marketing and just trying to tag on to whatever the fad is to, is this actually useful? Does this thing make sense?
Yeah, I think AI has a lot of potential and a lot of opportunity to streamline some of the more monotonous jobs that we have, or to be able to identify more of the anomalies that we are able to see, because it's all built on data, right? And if you're able to process data faster and come up and make decisions on that data faster, well, obviously things are going to be better. So I think AI has some definite potential. When you talk about cloud, we don't go to an organization these days that is not in the cloud in some way, shape, or form, as far as how their business is operating. And when you talk about the connectivity between on-prem, cloud, SaaS, all those different things, the only way that an organization can properly manage those environments is through proper access control. We're big advocates here of making things as simple as possible. So single sign-on is one of those simple ways to do things. If you have a company that has to manage identity in 12 different SaaS-based applications in Azure, on-prem, et cetera, and somebody leaves, you're going to leave yourself vulnerable to a potential attack, because the likelihood that you're going to forget to remove access from one of those applications or one of those areas where you have an identity stored, that is really high. We see it all the time with companies that we work with. So single sign-on is one of those big things that, you push when you talk about cloud and you talk about, those different aspects.
Yeah. When Jeff brought up cloud, it kind of kicked off in my mind, cloud is one of the few things, especially when you're talking cloud as SaaS, identity is one of the few things that you can actually control from a security perspective. On a SaaS application, that may be the only thing, and that goes to your point about single sign-on, managing a central IDP, that's certainly important. But even like public cloud platforms as a service, identity is certainly something you can control. You can still control, I think we were talking about with the other vectors is like, potentially leaving the configurations poor in terms of what's publicly available, things like that, are not only publicly available, but are you denying access by default? But it ultimately does come back to logging in usually. Like you can put poor controls on it, but if somebody has a credential, they're probably going to get in. And if they don't, they're probably not going to get in unless you have a really bad configuration. So for my money, and of course I'm like the identity practitioner, so I'm always like identity number one. But for my money, it's like that is where we're still going to be empowered. We're empowered today and we'll be empowered more and more in the future to manage identity and have less and less control over everything else.
Yep. Yeah. And if you don't limit the number of people that have the access or those credentials, the worse it's going to be. I actually had a customer, this was, 7-8 years ago. We did a PCI assessment for them, and we found that during one of our reviews, they had 300 people with administrative access to their PCI environment, their cardholder data environment. And it was 300 people at an organization that managed that environment. That was their job. And we're like, why do you have 300? Like, that's a risk. And they were like, well, the reason why we have to have 300 is because they have 300 people that at any given time are going to need to access our environment. And we don't want to have to issue you credentials or anything like that, or have them check out passwords or, any of those neat techniques. It was just easier to give everybody a credential. Well, we were like, well, you shouldn't have 300 people have access. Well, they were able to, push back, and the PCI DSS is a wonderful thing, but it doesn't say how many people can have access. It just says that you have to control access to the least amount possible. Fast forward 3 months later, and somebody at that managed service provider got popped, and they found their way into the PCI environment and were able to get away with some credit card numbers. So, lesson learned there, like you have to keep that reduced, because that's your attack surface right there. If you have way too many people with access, your attack surface is now much wider than it should have been. And all it takes is one person. I had another client.
Well, hold on real quick.
I have all kinds of stories there.
No, you got great stories, but I just wanted to point out, like, what you hear a lot. So for a practitioner learning point is when you hear about, we've got to minimize the attack surface. That's what we're talking about. You want to try to reduce. It's just like, if you have to mow your own lawn, maybe you want to get as small of a yard as possible, so you're not spending all weekend mowing 15 acres or something.
Or you just need to get a really big mower.
It could be, because having a lot of acres would be nice, right? It's got other benefits. Or maybe you just hire somebody to take care of it for you.
There you go.
actually, while we have you here, I wanted to ask you a question. Jeff and I call these kind of the holy wars. So one of the holy wars in identity is like, where do you manage contractors? What should be the source of record for contractors? I'm not going to ask you that one. The other one is, where organizationally does IAM fit? Should it be in IT? Should it be in IS? Does it depend? What's your perspective on that?
Well, I mean, I'll go with the consulting answer. It depends. And here's what it depends on. If you don't have a strong leader in information security, and we still see this to this day, right? We call people a CISO, or, we relegate security to, somewhere within the IT department. I would say if you lack that level of leadership that is reporting to the executive team, right? They report to a CFO or a COO or even the board. If they're not at that level, I could see where it might make sense to have identity reside with the CIO or within IT. It is a business enabler. It is user experience has a lot to do with identity. So that's why I've seen it, or we've seen it a lot of times reside within IT. But it is the foundation of cybersecurity. And if I have the responsibility of an organization to help manage the risk of that organization through controls, I would like to own and have influence to drive the identity program myself. Yes, collaboration is key. And everybody's going to be like, well, you should be collaborating with the CIO and you should be collaborating with IT. Completely agree. And that's why I could reside under the CISO, because we will collaborate on it. We will make sure that user experience is great. But if we have to control access in the right way to reduce our attack surface, and again, as we talked about with the expanse of cloud and all, microsegmentation and all these other techniques that now we're employing or imploring to make the organization safer, I am a huge advocate that identity should reside under the office of the CISO as one of the programs that you would have responsibility as the CISO to set the North Star for, to figure out the mission, vision, values, to set the budget for, and to drive forward in terms of making sure it gets the right amount of resources instead of having resources diverted for other programs that may be part of, a big digital transformation initiative. So that's my defense for residing underneath the CISO. I know I'll probably you said you put my LinkedIn profile here later on in the show, probably get a lot of nasty grams, maybe even from some clients. So I apologize. But that would be where I would say it would reside. What do you think?
Well, here, you led off with depends. And I agree with that because, first of all, only a Sith deals in absolutes. There's a ton of gray Jedis out there that are, it does depend, because you mentioned the leadership, you mentioned the ability and the know-how to do something like that. And I do think it does depend. But my answer to this is typically, it doesn't matter so much who owns it, as long as somebody knows that they own it and that they have the capability and the resources to actually, affect that program and having it move forward. One of the models that I've seen recently is, not recently, but that I've seen success with recently, is this shared ownership model, where if you were to take the old adage of plan, build, run, plan might sit within information security. Build might sit somewhere else. They're taking, direction and guidance and policy, maybe from the plan side of things. And then the run may sit in a completely different part of IT, for example. Maybe it's engineering, and then maybe it goes to a help desk or something like that. So I think there is an opportunity to take that depends answer, apply it to the organization. Okay, well, what makes sense for us, right? Maybe the information security team is 3 people and they don't have the resources to do that. They are forced almost into having to be collaborative, which, to your point, they should have been doing all along. But that's an opportunity to look at different ways to do this. I don't think it has to be a binary, you take it all or nothing. I think you can carve out parts of that. Because one of the things that typically comes up is the idea of a RACI, right? Roles in the program. Does everybody know what they're doing? Who is the A? And does that person understand it that they're the A? Because I find a lot of people think that they are accountable for something when they're not really. They might be responsible or maybe, consulted or informed. And going through that exercise of creating your IAM program, there should be a step that says, okay, are we on the same page here? Do we all agree that Matt's in charge of the program? But Matt, there's a limit to your power, right? You're the A for policy, but I might be the A for building our IGA platform. And maybe Jim's the A for the privileged access platform, right? I think there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of skin that to make sure that the structure of the program is appropriate for the organization. I said a lot there, and I was able to get my Star Wars Sith in there. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I put my hood up, for you. I liked that, breaking it down, plan, build, run, because hiring a bunch of engineers to develop the identity solution when you might have engineers within IT already who are experienced in that area. Completely agree. I think it comes down to leadership, right? Who's going to lead through everything that you have to do from that perspective. I did like the RACI comment that you made. On the accountability side, though, you want to make sure you have one person accountable, because if multiple people are accountable, chances are nobody's accountable.
It's like Highlander. There can only be one.
Yeah, there you go. 100%. So I like that idea. I think I definitely could see that working within an organization. I have a client that identity has bounced around a few different places, a few different times. It was in IT, then all moved over to security, then all of security moved back over to IT. Now security is back out, and it brought identity with it. The former CIO wanted to pull identity back into IT. So it goes a lot of different places. One of the problems that client was looking to solve was the run standpoint, and help desk was having some issues with getting vished or voice phishing. Because, as human beings, a lot of times we trust way too easily. So they had problems with folks getting vished. So they wanted cybersecurity to own that part as well, because cybersecurity professionals are skeptical by nature, right? It's what we do. We're always the ones that are walking into buildings and you're like, okay, I could do this is bad. This is bad. So that skepticism, comes through when somebody's trying to reset their password.
So Matt, I thought what you might say to me was, I think you're asking a trick question. Why wouldn't the CISO report to the CIO? And therefore, basically you get 2 for 1, or the CIO does. And I feel like that's what I've seen the most, is that the CISO reports to the CIO. So from a reporting structure, it is both. But here's the root of the problem for me, is that I kind of feel like it's a little bit of the fox guarding the hen house, in terms of, I think there's a what do you call it? Like a segregation of duties, or potential conflict of interest, where you as the CISO are setting up all these security policies. You must go through XYZ penetration testing and you set all the metrics of where an application has to be before you can roll a major upgrade, or before you can roll out new software. And now you're under the gun with commitments to go live by a certain time. And, well, do you loosen up your policies so that you don't miss your deadline? I mean, are CISOs going to do that? Not necessarily, but this is what conflict of interest is all about. It's like, avoiding kind of that undue pressure. So that is my concern about putting operational things under the CISO.
So I think the CISO oftentimes falls under the CIO because no other executive feels comfortable that they understand what a CISO does. But I believe, and you can read it for, it's a tale as old as time, that the CISO should not report up through the CIO because of that conflict of interest. They, control the same budget. A lot of times you could end up sacrificing security for functionality. And if you don't have somebody at an equal level or somebody, able to report outside of that structure, be the ones that say that this is a bad idea, then you'll have some issues. I have a friend. They were not a client at the time. They were going to be a client. He is a friend. He pulled us in, and he reported. He was the CISO. He reported to the CIO. They had to. He got in. He did an assessment. They had this, major issue that they were trying to solve. They pulled me in. We helped put together and figure out the path forward. To solve for all of the vulnerabilities they had, their absence of alignment from a regulatory standpoint to the controls requirements that they had. He put together the plan, went to go report it to his CIO, get budget, and start executing on the project. And his CIO said, yeah, that budget that you had is gone. I spent it on a cloud project. And it was like, but we're not going to be compliant. Yeah, I think we'll be okay because, as we move to the cloud, we'll be able to, get out of the compliance game. And it's like, that's fundamentally wrong. But, you just took the budget that was there for the CISO to help control the risk of the organization to do something that's going to be, functionally different and maybe serve the one part of the needs of the business better, but you're leaving the organization exposed to, a huge risk here by making that move. Whereas if that person reported outside of that structure, they got their own budget, they have their own reporting lines. If the CIO and CISO wanted to battle for that budget, for those things, they could go back and forth and then present it to the business and say, you could do this cloud project today, but you are leaving yourself exposed to these fines, these risks, et cetera, et cetera. Are you okay with that? Versus the CIO making that decision. Come to find out, that CIO had a, bonus package tied to that move to the cloud. So that's why those funds were siphoned over there. But that's why we're an advocate of keeping it outside of it. To your point, the fox guarding the hen house, right? If security is within IT, that's exactly what you have. So you keep that outside, you force that collaboration, but then you also force those two sides to, be able to work together to understand what do we need to do to make the business better, faster, and what do we need to do to make sure that, maybe it's got a little bit of a guardian on it to make sure that we don't get out of control.
Is this a negotiation point for CISOs and people aspiring to be CISOs to really maybe try to dictate what that reporting structure looks like? If I go in and say, okay, I like the role, I want to be a CISO, but I want to report to you, CEO, right? Or something like that. Is that a viable way to approach a conversation like that? Do you think that that's a turnoff for people who are looking for CISOs where they'd want to kind of define their own organizational reporting?
I mean, it depends on where you are in your career. If you just want that title of a CISO, that's, and you've never been a CISO before, I think that's a tough.
You'll take it where you can get it.
I think that's a tough point to negotiate from, right? If you've been a CISO before and you can talk business and you understand business, because I think a lot of folks from a CISO standpoint, they still talk in tech speak. And if you're still talking in tech speak, I think a lot of times that's what makes, CEOs or CFOs nervous from
especially
that reporting
first time
perspective.
Yeah,
because they don't understand it. Yeah, 100%.
And they have a hard time relinquishing control. They are the worst CISOs because they are so technically involved with everything that they haven't been able to abstract themselves out and actually be strategic sometimes in their thinking. So I just see that.
I think that's key. So, for those folks that are aspiring to be a CISO, Look at taking business classes, finance classes, getting your MBA, your executive MBA, and that's going to really give you, with that technical background, which I am a strong advocate that you need to have. With that technical background, if you can learn the business side, you're unstoppable from that perspective. And then if you're able to talk and bring that technical aspects to the business in a way that they understand it, well, then you have, you're fighting from a strong negotiation point there to be able to say, yeah, I'll take this job, but only if I report to you as a CEO or you as a CFO, separate from the CIO.
So on this holy war, Jeff, we've finally reached clarity. It depends. It depends.
Did we think we were going to get anywhere else? I mean, come on.
No.
We got 3 consultants sitting in a room, and we all came up with great ways to say it depends.
I'll argue the other side too, if you want me to.
I'm sure. And we can, Jeff, I think we can have a 2-hour podcast with Matt. So I think we should just plan to have him back at some date in the future. But being that we're bumping up about an hour now, we probably ought to go to a later note. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, Matt, you've been very generous with your time. It's also, in the evening now, 6:30 Eastern. So I know it's a long day. I definitely would love to have you back, Mac, if you will, join us again, because I think there's so much for us to talk through. I want to close out the show on a little bit of a sports thing. We were talking earlier about reducing attack surfaces. And what I thought about that, I'm a big football fan, NFL. And one of the things that people would used to say is you got to get skinny. And what that meant was you've got to get small and cut through the holes that your offensive line is making for you, because you're not going to have, all the room in the world unless you're the Philadelphia Eagles, apparently. But that's a different discussion. But you have to get skinny in that sort of, making yourself small to fit through the hole. So I know you do a lot of coaching with sports. I think you're doing wrestling, football, baseball. You've got at least 3 sons that we know of. So tell me about sort of your sports world, because I know people who coach, one sport, maybe 2, but you're coaching a variety of different things. What's drawing you to that?
So I only have three sons, okay. And I know that I only have 3. So we're good there. What's drawn me to sports is that I grew up in a sports family. I had 3 brothers. We all played sports. My oldest brother actually, coached at extremely high levels, college football, actually with the lieutenant governor here of Ohio. And my other brother played college football. I was more drawn toward wrestling. And my younger brother was more drawn toward baseball. So I played them all. And that's why I, initially wanted to get involved in coaching. I did a little bit of it post high school with some wrestling camps, and then helped out with the high school program where I went to school when I was in college. And then as I had kids, to me, it was a great way for me to be able to spend time with them. We live in a very small town. I think my son's whole class at each level, they each have like 80 kids in their whole grade. So we're hurting for people to help. So I volunteer to help wherever I possibly can. It forces me to quit working at 5:00 normally. I'm staying for you guys, but it forces me to quit at 5:00 because I have to go to practice. And then when I'm coaching football, I'm thinking about nothing else, or coaching wrestling or baseball or soccer. I'm thinking about nothing else but what's in that moment. So it helps me live in the moment, and it helps me bond with my children at the same time. So that's one of the primary reasons why I do it. There's the role that I serve in the organization is coaching as well. So it just all kind of ties together for me. And you're helping to get people to do things that they didn't expect that they could do when they started, and to see that growth throughout the course of a year is really cool as well.
So what ages are you coaching?
So right now I do, for wrestling, it is anybody from, we have a 3-year-old girl on our team, all the way up to 6th grade. And that's really cool because it's all different levels. That 3-year-old girl's dad is a professional MMA fighter. So she's already, one bad person. And then, so that's cool. For football, my oldest son does not play football. But my middle son does, and my youngest one does. So that is first grade, kindergarten, and then pre-K. For baseball, I coach them all. So it's 10-year-old, it's 6-year-old, and it's, just T-ball kind of thing. And then soccer is just the middle one and the younger one right now. So
so I don't know how you find
younger
time to do all this.
You force it. You have to do it. Because if I didn't do it, I don't know who else would. And I'm really, when I want my kids to learn a certain way. So I didn't coach soccer before. And I don't know if the guy who was coaching my son at the time was listening. I doubt it, but you never know. My son, my older son, he's not naturally athletic. He is intellectually driven. He is not instinctively driven. So he a lot of times would end up playing out of 4 quarters. He would play 2 per game on soccer, and he would pay the back row. And it's recreation soccer. And I went up to the coach and I was like, "Hey, you know what? Can you help me understand your philosophy here on why you're only rotating the same kids up front and you don't have them sit, and you have these kids all play in the back and they sit?" And he's like, "Well, it's a mix between playing time and winning." And I'm like, "They're 8. And that was the end of it for me. So I'm always a strong advocate of, if you're going to run your mouth at coaches, you better back it up. So I started coaching soccer because I believe, at this age that my kids all are, what you're trying to do is to spark something. You want them to enjoy the sport. It doesn't matter about winning. Now, winning helps you to enjoy the sport, but if you lose, but your kid scores a goal because they played in the front, they don't normally play in the front, or they learn different things because they're playing up front, they don't normally play up front, and they want to come back next year, that is a bigger win than what shows up on the scoreboard. So that's the way that I coach everything at this current stage, because it's all, recreational. Wrestling gets a little bit more intense, but for baseball, soccer, football, it's all about rotating the kids to every position, because the biggest kid in the world today doesn't need to play offensive line. They might not grow anymore and have to play, running back. So I'm all about getting kids exposure to every position and getting them to love the game and want to come back. So I forget what your question was, but I could talk for days about coaching.
Well, I love the passion behind it. I mean, it does take a certain love of what you do to be able to do that, right? I mean, it takes time. It's not, it's not like you're sitting there playing video games.
No,
right?
No,
which I would love to do, but there's
me too. I would love
right?
it.
Yeah.
It helps me professionally too, because while I'm coaching adults, you'd be surprised.
I am not surprised whatsoever. That's for sure. Having spent a decade plus in food service, you learn people's ranch dressing is not the most important thing in the world at that moment. I totally get it, for sure.
Yep.
Jim, you've got a couple boys. Have you ever coached them? I know you're probably a big baseball, but what have you done?
A few years of travel baseball, yeah. And I think what Matt was saying is, like, they're young, but there is a mix of expectations from the parents of, like, kids that are, like, more advanced, better players, especially in travel ball, right? They're, like, anybody can sign up for rec, but there's, like, a tryout system and all that. They're expecting you to push and play in more advanced tournaments. And there are kids who are further behind and not ready to go and play in those tournaments. And then you get into the stage where it's like, you almost have to, like, talk to the parents like, yeah, your kids aren't ready to keep up with the rest of the team, and, like, next year they need to go find a new team to play for. And dealing with, like, 9 and 10-year-old kids, it's just like, I just didn't want to do that. So like when it got to that stage, that was time for me to get out of it. But I resonated what Matt said, because then my kids continued to play on after I stopped coaching. And I realized like I wasn't going to go and tell that coach, use my kid in this way or do this or do that, because I learned that those are the people you can't stand. They don't put the time into it that you do, and yet want to tell you how to run your show. And so, that basically, I think what it became for me was, with my kids, like, right, I think my kids are being treated fairly, or they're not. They're being treated fairly. I would talk to my son about, this is what you should be doing. This is how you should interact with the coach, how you should, if you want to bat higher in the lineup, hit better. You want to play first base, let them know. I'd like to show you I can play first base. I've been working on it outside of practice. I'm pretty good at it, etc. And if I thought the kids are being treated unfairly and my kids are doing the right things, just like, hey, it's time to move on. Because the reality is, like, when they're your kids, you're kind of tied to their personal success. And I think I think I was pretty realistic about where my kids stood athletically, but I also realized they're my kids and I love them. And so, like, I might think they're better than this other coach thinks, or for whatever reason, he's not playing my kids. So maybe it's time to move on and find a different team. Now, I wasn't in like a super small town like Matt, so there was some opportunity to move up or down in terms of levels and stuff like that. So, but yeah, I guess the takeaway is super fun. There's a lot of rewarding part, but when you're coaching, there's a lot of hard part that comes with it too. And what I just kind of described there is like, these aren't adults at work where it's like, someone's not performing and you give them a couple of warnings and then you fire them and they deserve to be fired or whatever. These are little kids. And so, like,
you never know what you're going to get. One day
you got to work on fly balls, because you keep dropping fly balls, and then they keep dropping fly balls. You're just going to go in there and be like, you're kicked off the team. Like, all their friend group is now on the team. Like, that's a pretty tough thing. So it just wasn't for me. That part of it wasn't for me.
So I've got
fortunately, I don't coach at that level yet. So,
so here's my next $1 million idea. Once I'm done, identity podcasting, is I'm going to create Hard Knocks for like little league teams, and take it behind the scenes of like all these, youth sports, and really kind of dramatize it, right, and show that all that, and all the parents and the language. And
you don't need to dramatize it. There's plenty.
I know
of drama.
it's going to be it's going to be legit real life. So, HBO, if you're listening, or Max, whatever we're called now, there's my submission for a new show, is like Hard Knocks. I don't know, small town USA baseball or football, or maybe everything, right? Something like that. Okay. We've been talking for an hour. Matt, as usual, you're just always a pleasure and a gentleman to speak with us. You can find us on the web. We're at idacpodcast.com. I will have Matt's LinkedIn profile in our show notes. So if you have questions, comments, concerns, you can always, reach out to him that way. And don't forget to connect with Jim and I on LinkedIn as well. We're always happy to, talk, engage, answer questions, take ideas for future shows and things like that. So please reach out. If you enjoyed this, like, subscribe, share it with a friend, share it with an enemy. Doesn't matter, as long as they hit like and subscribe too. And with that, we'll leave it. So thanks everyone for watching and or listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.